A judge has okayed, after a delay earlier this week, judge has okayed the removal efforts of the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. So they're now in the process. It's supposed to be removed in its entirety by the 1st of January. So this will happen pretty rapidly. And if you were to go and take a look at what's being said on left wing websites, or New York Times, wherever, they'll tell you that this is a victory over racism and the veneration of fascism and slavery and all this sort of stuff. So I thought, instead of even just engaging in the high level, why are they trying to tear down statues, memorials, history, and where does this end? Because if any connection of any kind for something to slavery means that it has to be erased and pulled from public display, we're going to have to figure out what we're going to call Washington D.C. Right? We all understand this. They understand it for sure, and they view this as a weapon to use against the shared sense of culture, history, and just understanding of what it is to be an American that we all have today, right? If you tear away the founding fathers, the Constitution, if you get rid of all of that, well, what's left? Well, whatever they decide to replace it with. But I actually thought it would be more useful to discuss how we got to this point, or what the history of this is. The Arlington National Cemetery, believe it or not, I believe it was George Washington's adopted son's daughter had that plot of land at one point, and then Robert E. Lee, yeah, that Robert E. Lee, was the executor of an estate that controlled what is now it was less, I think it was a couple hundred acres, but now Arlington National Cemetery is about 600 plus acres. But in terms of the Confederate monuments specifically, well, let's go back to what happened. You get after the Civil War, you have Reconstruction in the South, and it basically ends 1877. President Rutherford B. Hayes withdraws federal troops from the South. And as we all know, there was still tremendous racism and segregation and policies of disenfranchisement and abuse toward Black Americans. And it was systemic across the South. So the policies, or the idea of uniting the country, was still had a long way to go in that regard. And it still had a long way to go with regard to just those who were Southerners, white Southerners, and Northerners. There was a lot of resentment that was still felt at that time in the country. But then there is something of an opportunity toward unity that presents itself, as so often happens in societies throughout history, with the beginning of the Spanish American War in 1898. So all of a sudden, you have people who are feeling, you have Southerners, you have white Southerners who are saying, I'm going to go fight for my country. So this was seen as an opportunity. 33 years after the end of the Civil War, there's this chance to bring the country together against a common enemy. In this case, the Empire of Spain. And President McKinley saw it as this moment in time where something could be done to bring the country together. McKinley served himself. We all know how McKinley unfortunately met his end, but McKinley had served in the 23rd Ohio Infantry, fighting for the Union. He enlisted as a private and made it all the way through to 1865 as as an officer. And he appointed 3 Civil War veterans to command the campaign in Cuba. 2 of them were Medal of Honor winners for the Union. And the third was Fighting Joe Wheeler, who was a Confederate cavalry general. And he had been elected to Congress in Alabama in 1880 and had been part of the effort to heal the wounds of the country. The Civil War had hundreds of thousands of dead on both sides. A lot of Americans gave their lives for their cause and for their side. So in 1900, Congress authorized, and again, this is part of this move to bring the country, bring North and South further together, emotionally, spiritually, ideologically after the wounds of the Civil War. So in 1900, Congress allows Confederate remains to be um, taken from their, reinterred, taken from their grave sites around D.C. and moved to Arlington National Cemetery in what is now called Section 16. So that was that was obviously quite a change, a move toward peace. President McKinley did his Peace Jubilee nationwide tour, and he proclaimed as follows. This was actually in 1898. This is before the graves were moved. But he said, in the spirit of fraternity, we should share with you in the care of the graves of Confederate soldiers. Sectional feeling no longer holds back the love we feel for each other. The old flag again waves over us in peace with new glories. Now, to be clear, this new moment of bonding and bringing together the country still excluded African Americans who were in a segregated burial plots at Arlington until President Truman in 1948 integrated Arlington. Um, so in 1903, the first Confederate Memorial Day ceremonies held in the Arlington Confederate section. President Theodore Roosevelt sent a floral arrangement. So he actually sent flowers along. By the way, Jim Webb, who's a Marine veteran, did an excellent editorial laying out a lot of this in the Wall Street Journal, in which he was saying, "Look, I think that the removal of this monument, at least understand why the monument is there, right? For all these people writing, oh, it's awful, it's about slavery, it's about elevating the South and racism, and they're Nazis, but they're just Nazis before the Nazis existed. Hold on a second. This monument was meant to heal wounds that the country had and bring the two sides together. And people who had actually fought the Confederacy, people who had lost family members to the Civil War, were involved in this process of reconciliation. They wanted the country to come back together. So in 1906, Secretary of War Taft allowed the Daughters of the Confederacy to raise money to build a memorial, right? So first the graves are moved. There's the reinterred graves, and then they have this memorial that is starting to be built, and it's actually built by Moses Jacob Ezekiel, who is a artist sculptor and a Confederate veteran, and the first Jewish American to graduate from the Virginia Military Institute. So, some interesting backstory on how this all got built. So, if you look at this, I haven't been to the memorial. I've only seen photos of it, but there's a 32-foot tall female figure, classic Greco-Roman, kind of classical antiquity looking figure. And then there are a bunch of smaller figures depicted in the sculpture below. And there are some inscriptions. There's the Latin phrase, first, they have beat their swords. This is a biblical inscription, actually. They've beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And the whole purpose of creating this monument at the time was to try to bring together the feeling of unity, North and South. And that was seen by presidents, by veterans of both sides, by people as a worthy goal. And this is not meant to elevate. I mean, there's so much more complexity on the issue than people will generally allow. And as I said in the Webb editorial on this, he lays out there were a number of states, for example, that did not give up their slaves, who fought for the Union but did not give up the slaves they already had over the course of the war. I know from visiting in Charleston, they have the slave auction museum there. That 3% of Southerners own 97% of the slaves, and that of the 258,000 Confederate soldiers who died, which is a roughly 30% figure of those who actually took up arms for the South, a tiny percentage of them overall actually even owned slaves. So when you understand, I think, the greater historical context of why this monument was built and what it is meant to symbolize, it is not meant to be an excuse for, and none of the people involved in constructing it, the government officials who approved it. It was not supposed to be about, oh, you know, slavery was a cause that we should think of as, close, but they didn't win or something, right? It wasn't meant to. It was meant to bring together the two sides that had fought a horrific war that killed hundreds of thousands on both sides, and to bring the Union together. This all comes, by the way, this destruction, or I should say removal, because officially they're just removing it. But where is it going to go? It's in a place of honor, obviously, in Arlington Cemetery. Where is it going to be moved to? They'll put it in the basement of some museum, I'm sure. So I know they have some plan for it, but who knows where it will actually end up. This all comes from the George Floyd panic. They also don't talk about this very much. Right, George Floyd, the convicted felon and drug addict who died of heart failure in a interaction with police. Yes, he was convicted of George Floyd's murder. We could have a whole other discussion about whether that was politically motivated or not, and whether the jury even felt they could deliver a fair verdict or not. But in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021, it's like almost $1 trillion bill. They had they empowered a naming commission to remove, quote, all names, symbols, displays, monuments, and paraphernalia that honor or commemorate the Confederate States of America. So they slipped this into the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. And now we're all supposed to think that somehow what is accomplished by this, other than forcing people to, well, one, I think, live in ignorance, because so few people actually even know how this came to be. They just hear Confederate monument, and then they want to remove, they want to destroy, they want to take it away. What's the purpose of this specific monument? Remember, these are the same voices on the left that wanted to get rid of a statue commemorating emancipation of the slaves with money raised from former slaves to pay for it, because they did not like the depiction in the statue of some of the emancipated slaves. It's never enough. I mean, there will never be, you can never appease this side. All you can do is allow them to destroy whatever history that you think you know of this country, and replace it with this distorted version of America is a bad, awful, racist place with nothing redeemable about it. And only if we have Marxist, identity politics obsessed lunatics in charge can we ever, be a better place. I reject that. And I think many of you do as well.